Thank you. All right, so one of the people, when we went downstairs, kind of said, well, hey, so we got the tough lecture out of the way, the most controversial lecture out of the way, which is evolution. I can tell you that probably this one is even more controversial. You know why? Because we are all in the church. We all read the Bible. We all read the biblical text. And we all think we know what the text says. But then it becomes very hard to make sense. In fact, I would tell you that this lecture is even more controversial than the previous one. So for the previous one, your minds were kind of a bit, overwhelmed. This one is even more. But what did we come up with the last lecture? We came up from the last lecture that at least the scientific evidence, and I think this is the conclusion of that. The scientific evidence is really controversial. That whether or not evolution from a single cell ancestry, common ancestry, is a valid point or not. Remember what I said about the evidence and the observational science versus experimental. The crux of the matter is as follows. Based on the observational science of what we're seeing at this point of our genetic composition, we're finding a lot of enigmas. And we, as a group of scientists, are trying to make sense of these enigmas and to explain. Could we all have evolved from a single cell? And if yes, what was the mechanism? Okay? And the difficulty is when we are using experimental science versus observational science, and when those overlap. As I said, the genetic evidence for common cell ancestry is quite strong. It is quite strong, even though for us as Christians, it was like, I wish this was not the case. But that biological evidence, if you're going to take it from a scientific standpoint, is quite compelling. However, saying that, what is not compelling and what is still being very debated is the mechanism. How did we get to that point? Was this mechanism an evolutionary process in its entirety, or was it also guided in some sense? And I presented to you the two big groups of Christian scientists, one of them called the intelligent design camp, and the other one called the theistic evolution camp. I would probably tell you, for most part, both camps do believe in common ancestry. Okay? I think the big debate between them is the mechanism and how that mechanism comes. So, Biological Apologetics 2015. In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all, charity and humility. I would put that in addition there. Genesis 1-3. Can we reach an agreement? The problem with Genesis 1-3, you've got several questions. You've got the question of beginning of the cosmos. And then you go from the beginning of the cosmos to the beginning of life. And then from the beginning of that first cell to the beginning of man. And then the problem, and here the best analogy I can give is that for this complexity, you are as if you're going on a railroad. You know the railroad, guys? You've got a train, you've got a track and another one, and they both have to remain parallel all throughout the way for the train to move, correct? If one track is off by an angle, can that train move? It cannot. And this exact analogy applies to us, because on one track, you've got the biblical interpretation. The issue that we're going to debate in this lecture is not the biblical text in of itself. The text has no problem. It's the interpretation that has question marks. And the other one is the scientific interpretation. For any one of us here, I would challenge all of us that all of us have to make our minds and our decision on both tracks. Because on both tracks, if one of them is going left and the other one is going right, you are going to be stuck and you're going to be confused. But your scientific understanding has to match your theological and biblical understanding. And you will find, and I'll show you at the end of this lecture, based on the current different biblical interpretations, how these scientific camps, both theistic evolution and intelligent design, which biblical interpretation do they adopt? Am I saying that's right? I'm not saying that. I'm saying I'm presenting you the different camps and the different interpretation. I'll go back to the first lecture when I said, you know what, go and do your research. Go and do your own reading. But the complexity of this railroad is this is what it looks like. This is exactly what it looks like. Because not only you've got 5 to 6 to 7 different scientific interpretations, you have 5 to 7 different biblical interpretations, and then you can almost mix and match as a scientist any different scientific interpretation and marry it to a different biblical interpretation, and this is who you would be. Can I say, well, this is truth versus this is truth versus this is truth? I'll be very, very, very ignorant and tell you I cannot really make a dogmatic statement about evolution and the biblical account from Genesis, except in 3 statements. Number 1, that God created all. Number 2, God created all out of nothing and for good. And number 3, God created all out of nothing for good and for man's glory. The how and the when, I would be very ignorant to tell you that I don't think I can be 100% dogmatic, and I will show you the evidence for that. This is the biological lay of the land, and we talked about it that you've got the creationist on one side, you've got the intelligent design and theistic evolutionist in the middle, and then you've got the Darwinist, if I may say, who does not believe, in God at all, on the other side. The creationists, as we probably already know, the young earth creationists believe that Earth, its entire universe, everything was created within 6 to 7,000 years, including the universe, including the earth, including mankind, including Adam, including everything. Okay? The old earth creationists are probably a mix and match because there's multiple camps within this big family. They believe that the earth and the universe are ancient, but mankind as we know it is only 6 to 7,000 years. And then you've got the ID camp and the theistic evolution camp. That is the biological lay of the land within the Christian. All this, you remember my first lecture when I said within the big family called the Christian box, okay, the Catholic, the Orthodox, and the Protestant, all these 3 camps are within there. When it comes to the biblical interpretation becomes a little bit different. You find different camps there. There is one camp called the historical literal, which believed that the biblical account is historical and it should be interpreted in its literal sense. And then you've got something called the historical figurative, which believes that it is historical, it has happened, but the language that is used is figurative language. And the figurative language denotes an actuality of fact, but the language itself is figurative. And then you've got the mythical. The mythical is the group that says that this is completely a myth and a legend. And by the way, I want to make a very clear clarification. Symbolic is not mythical. There are some people within the Christian camp, predominantly in the more liberal Catholic interpreters, okay, that think of the biblical creation as a symbolic event with what happened to all humanity. But it's different than mythical. Mythical, okay, carries within it a legend, carries within it something that has never happened. But the symbolic says it has happened, but the story is there to give us a symbolic meaning. So the meaning is what the symbolic interpretation is looking at, not the exact occurrence of the event. When you look at principles of biblical interpretation, and for sure we can't cover this in 45 minutes, but you have to ask yourself the first question, what is a genre? A genre of the writing, because you know what? You cannot take a book, for example, as the Psalms and Proverbs, which is a poetic book, and compare it to a book which is like Chronicles that talks of historical events, to a book like the Wisdom of Solomon that is wisdom literature. You cannot equate Revelation, which is more apocalyptic literature, and equate that same genre, that same style of writing to, for example, the epistles or the gospels. So you have to be very careful. And this becomes the big question. What does Genesis 1 to 3 fall under? Is it historical to be treated the same as the Chronicles, as 1st and 2nd Kings? Or is it poetic like Psalms? Or is it something in the middle? Number 2, when you say the use of metaphors and similes and figurative speech, this is not mythical. When you, for example, and this is a very simple example, but when you say, for example, oh my God, did you see this car? It was flying on the road. This guy was flying. Well, we know very well when you talk about this that flying, that is a figurative speech. Okay, because actually he was not flying. But does this figurative speech denote something that is happening, that actuality in history has happened? Yes. So although the figurative speech is used, and you cannot take it out of context and say, well, yes, this car was literally flying, on the other side, you cannot say that this is figurative, this didn't mean that the car didn't even exist. So when you are applying figurative speech, you're trying to find out the limitations of the figurative speech. And be sure that you don't go outside of it, nor you make it so restricted that it is meaningless. There's always this big debate of what did the original audience mean? This is like when you study biblical studies, this is a huge, big debate because we know very well that the biblical message was given for all times and all ages. It was transcultural, trans-time. But when you're understanding it right now, we have to also admit that that language, when it was used, when it was written in a context of an original audience that read it. And God, although has the message, be very careful with what I'm talking, has the message that transcends culture and time, the language might not. I'm going to say this again because this is very important. The message of the Bible transcends time and culture, but in some instances, the language might not, because the language, as anyone who studies linguistics and studied culture and studied anthropology, knows that language is conditioned by culture and time. And the Bible uses a language that is used at that point, but the message does not change. Very careful. And by the way, this is what biblical scholars spend their whole life studying. So we can't take it very lightly. Concordism, which is a big issue, because a lot of people right now, especially in this debate, especially they're coming from the young earth creationist, the ultra-conservative, the fundamentals, saying, you know what, you bunch of scientists and you bunch of biblical liberal scholars are trying to fit the biblical message that has been there for thousands of years because you want to fit it within the context of the findings of science. And when you do this, this is called concordism, and you know what? You are going to lose because the Bible transcends even all the science. And they give a big example. It's like, well, when people look at the verse, the creator of heavens who stretches them out, and it's actually mentioned that 17 times in the Bible, it's mentioned that God stretches out the heavens. Is this the Big Bang? And people would say, well, hey, the Bible talked about the Big Bang because you know what it says over here, that God stretches the heavens. I don't think so. I don't think so. But that's kind of the danger of concordism. When we are reading the biblical message based on new scientific data that keep coming up and keep changing. Because the biblical message doesn't change. And we can't keep adapting it and changing it all the time based on new scientific evidence. What are the three big problems in Genesis 1 to 3? Here are the three. 1, creation out of nothing. Creation ex nihilo. 2, interpretation of days. 3, what to do with man. What to do with man. You remember when I talked about yesterday the presuppositions, fact-finding that you come up with a belief. The problem that you see a lot in these Christian camps is some of them are unbelievably gung-ho and dogmatic about certain things that they just don't want to look at facts otherwise. And that becomes a problem because they are ridiculed from right and left. So when you look at the biblical lay of the land, okay, you find that all of them agree on biblical inerrancy. Inerrancy at this point is talking about the text. The text itself is inerrant. Why? Because the text has been transmitted through multiple manuscripts, multiple locations, multiple languages, and the text is the text. So the inerrancy is not in the text itself, is in the different kind of interpretation. And you look over here, you've got the literal, you've got the historical context interpretation, and then you've got the figurative. We're going to start with the literal. The literal, their presuppositions is number 1, that God is there. Theism is absolutely mandated. Number 2, that literal biblical revelation. From their standpoint, the presupposition is that when the Bible was revealed, when the Bible was given, it was given as literal as a language as it is. And then no matter what findings that come up as scientific evidence, doesn't change much. And you get the young earth creationist. You all have seen the debate between Kevin Ham and Bill Nyes. It was about 2 years ago. And surprisingly, a lot of churches in the United States showed that. If you would take actually within the United States, about 45 to 50% of evangelicals are in this camp. 45 to 50% of evangelicals are in this camp, which I find it a bit hard sometimes to believe because they are some of the smartest people you'll ever meet. And that's what they endorse. So I respect them, but I have a hard time buying into their beliefs. So we're going to see a couple of slides like this, so please pay attention. Okay? Biblical, the literalist view. Days of creation are 6 24-hour periods. Okay? They are 6 24-hour periods. Sequence of creation as literally mentioned in Genesis 1. So the sequence is exactly as it's mentioned. Age of the universe based on Bishop Ussher, who said that it was 4004 BC. The age of the universe is about 6,000 to 7,000 years. They'll actually even give you a little bit of wiggle room. They'll say, well, we understand very well that the genealogies of Genesis, there was some overlap. Some people, were omitted. They lumped up 3 generations into 1 generation. But they would tell you at a maximum, it's 10,000 years, not more than that. Did death exist prior to fall? The question that was asked in the previous session. For them, no. And this was for all living beings, which I find it very hard biologically. I'm going to talk about the biblical criticism after the slide. But biologically, how can God create a biological system, a sphere, that is sustainable without death to being in it? Because even if we grant that all creatures at that time were vegetarian, well, if you eat a plant, that is death for the plant. So, but for them, for the ultra-fundamental young earth creationists, they do not believe that death existed prior to sin and fall for any kind of living creature. I would ask the question, is this a biologically sustainable system? Their answer is that, and I'm quoting their answer, is that this creation was equivalent, or to be equivalent to the creation in the second coming of Christ, when we don't need to eat or drink. But then the question will become, well, why do you need animals and plants at that point? Are they just to look pretty? So for them, death did not exist. Interpretation of fall, physical and spiritual death. Expulsion from God's presence and evil entering the whole world. Strength of young earth creationist. Number one, it's the most direct, most easy interpretation. If I am a Jew who lived back at the time and I read this, my interpretation will be like, oh, okay, 6 days. I'm fine with that. You take it for face value. The second thing, why would the text in 6 days keep repeating, and so the evening and the morning of day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6? What is the significance of mentioning this? Why is the text? Because usually when you find a text that keeps repeating the same phrase, there is a message there. Why was that message? When they look at the Hebrew word yom, which is very much like an Arabic yom, and you find that how this word is interpreted in other contexts in the biblical text, the Torah, the books of the Jews, yom for most part is defined as a 24-hour period, not an indefinite period. So they say by analogy, if that's how a Jewish reader would read it, then it has to mean 24 hours. Most importantly is for them the commandment when God gave them the 10 commandments and said in Exodus 20, verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath. They take it basically, the whole concept of a Sabbath, which is fundamental to the biblical message, was based on this verse that in 6 days God created the heavens and earth. Hence, if you don't believe there are 24 hours, then this is invalidated. They also quote when Jesus said, are there not 12 hours in the day? By the way, the word here is not yom, it's day. And it was a bit of a different context of what he was saying. But this is one of them. This one I love. I love this one. This is actually one of their strongest arguments. They said that this interpretation is timeless. It's timeless. Because you know what? No matter what scientific evidence will come, no matter what scientific theory will come, no matter what changes, let's say in 100 years from now, this whole evolution would be completely upside down and a completely new mechanism would be there to explain humanity. Well, at that time, you know what? We didn't really stick to evolution too much like theistic evolution. And they have a very nice saying, a theology that is wed, that is tied to the science of one age is a widow in the next. Very smart play on words. But that's what they say, is like, you know what? If you want a timeless message from the biblical account, do not think about science, whatever it's worth. And then they say, well, you know what? Also in the Genesis accounts it says that, you know what? Creation where everything was according to its kind. And they look at this right now, look at the current organism and the creation. Every kind is by itself. You can't breed a dog and a cat and come up with a dog cat. And they say, look at the current evidence and that this is according to its kind. And when God said they created him according to this kind, it has to be taken at its value. Challenges of young earth creationists. Since the time of the church father Origen, he's actually the one who actually brought this argument, and several others very much so. If you are saying there are 24-hour periods, and we know that the sun was created in day 4, how would you make sense of that? What were the 24 hours prior to this? Here are the, because it doesn't make sense, because a 24-hour period as a time is a factor of the earth revolving around itself. And before the creation of the sun and the day, and that there is a day and night, okay, you don't have that time factor. But their answers would be as follows. That God created actually the sun from day 1, but it was covered by clouds and it appeared on day 4. But since it was there since day 1, okay, that time was consistent with a 24-hour period. I don't know if you buy that, but that's their argument. Another argument that they say is that actually in the beginning of creation is very much like the end of creation. In the beginning, God was the light of the earth. Just like at the end when you look in Revelation, when it says about our Lord Jesus Christ, he's going to be its son. So they said like beginning, like the end. So in the very first 3 days, God was the light. And then the sun was created on day 4. But he asked him, well, what is then, where do the 24 hours come from? And they say, well, what's against God making the time and defining the time? I find it's a bit of a stretch because time is a factor of our nature. Okay? God is not confined. God is not going to set the clock. Okay, because this is a natural phenomena. So having God to be the source of light in the first 3 days, and he's the one who's setting the 24 hours, I think is a stretch of the text. Another challenge, when you look at actually Genesis 1, verse 11, it says over here, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields the seed, and the fruit that yields fruit according to its kind. And most people would debate, would say this, you know what, if I'm a farmer from the Jewish audience who's reading this book, I know very well that when the earth is bringing up a plant and a seed and a full tree that brings up fruit, it doesn't take 24 hours, it takes a lot more than that. So why would the text say at that point, let the earth bring up? Because there is a component of actually the earth, that's going through a natural cycle. That's what they're trying to say. That based on this text, there is a natural cycle of plant growth, and this natural cycle of plant growth is more than 24 hours. They would counter and say, well, you know what? Who's to say that God cannot just miraculously in one day, make the earth come up all quickly, the plants will come up. I think it's a stretch of the text. Another challenge of young earth creationists. When you guys look at Genesis, so anyone who's read the gospel would know, the Bible would know that actually you've got 2 creation narratives, one in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. In Genesis 2, it goes and revolves more around Adam. But when you look at Genesis 2 and you look at the events after Adam was created, and this is reported in Genesis 2, God created Adam, and then he brought to Adam all the animals of the creation so that he may name them. And after he may name them, he created Eve. Based at least, if I take the text at face value, how can you fit all this in a 24-hour period? It's just not logical. If you want to stick by the 24-hour period, It's just not doable. Unless you interpret Genesis 1 in a literal fashion and Genesis 2 in a non-literal fashion. But at that point, you are cherry picking. So, another argument against them. Another argument. So one of them say that, you know what, the word yom in Hebrew language means 24-hour periods, but it's been very, very clear that the word yom in the same text, because you're not bringing it up from another part of the Bible, within the same Genesis narrative, there is one occurrence that yom does not mean 24-hour period. Genesis 2:4. It says, in the generation of the earth and heaven, in the day the Lord created them. So that's the word yom. And that clearly at that point is not referring to a 24-hour period. So you can't be just too dogmatic and say, well, yom at this point means a 24-hour period, and you assume that. And then the last argument, which is very, very interesting. Out of the first 6 days, every one of them, it says that there was an evening and a morning, except for the day 7. Except for day 7. Day 7 is the only day that does not have an evening and morning, and that's the day that God rested and enjoyed the creation with his humanity. And we know for sure, based on that, this is not a 24-hour period, right? So if that yom, the 7th day, is referred to as a yom, how can you interpret this as a non-24-hour period, yet you interpret the first 6 as 24-hour period? Either you stick to your same rule throughout your interpretation or not. So if yom is referred to the first 6 days as 24-hour period, but then in the 7th day is not, you're cherry picking. And then the question becomes in Exodus. When God said, well, you know what, as in 6 days God created and then the 7th day he rested. Is that referring to 24-hour periods or referring to a pattern of days week? It's a pattern. God worked and then rested. And similarly, in that same pattern, you work and then you rest to enjoy the relationship, because that day 7 is a day of enjoyment of relationship with God. So God worked, created, and then the 7th day was a day of rest to enjoy the relationship with creation. So is it a pattern or is it the number of days? And this is the theological challenge. So I find this very interesting. Listen to this. So when a young earth creation scientist becomes challenged and says, well, you interpret the Bible that it's 7,000 to 8,000 years maximum, but yet the universe, okay, is appearing to us by measurement of light speed that is 14 to 15 billion years. And the earth, the fossils, when you're doing your carbon dating, appears to be at least 5 billion years. How do you mix those two together? And their theological interpretation, which I find it very hard, is that God, when he created the universe and mankind, 7,000 to 8,000 years, created it with the appearance of age. What does that mean? They'll give you an example. So based on their belief that Adam was created, special creation instantaneously, they will tell you when Adam was created, what did he appear to be like? Let's say a 25-year-old man. Okay? But is in his actuality, how old was he? Maybe a couple of minutes, a couple of seconds. But what did he appear? 25 years old. So he was created with the appearance of age, yet he was only 1 or 2 minutes truly old. And by the same analogy, the universe, although it is 7,000 to 8,000 years old, it appears it is 15 billion years old. The same analogy of Adam. And they cite a very, very interesting biblical support of that, and I find it very creative. That's the word I can say. They say the miracle of our Lord Jesus Christ in Cana of Galilee when he changed the water to wine. And they say, so what did Jesus do at that time? He changed the water to wine, right? And this just changed right that. But yet when they gave the wine to people to taste, what did they say of the wine? This wine is what? Is aged. Right? So although he created like that, but it was of age. And by the same analogy, God, in the beginning of creation of time, could create the whole universe that is 7,000 to 8,000 years old, yet it appears of age that is 15 billion years for a universe, 5 billion years for Earth, and that same analogy. I think theologically that's very, 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 very hard to grasp. Because why would God then put all these fossils? Why would God put all these strata? Why would God make this carbon dating? Why would God give us that appearance of the light? Why would God give us the appearance of the galaxies? It just doesn't make sense. Because then it puts God into this whole point of, he's a trickster. He's tricking us. And some of them, when you talk to them theologically, you say, well, God is doing this to test our faith. I find it hard. Okay? That God is specifically doing this to create it on a certain age, while it's not. And He creates this elaborate biological system and this whole universe that we have just to test us. I'm not sure that I buy that. The second camp is the camp of the progressive creationists and the old earth creationists. And, William Lane Craig, which a lot of you know, is probably in this camp. But in this camp, they're one big family, and within this family there are a lot of different interpretations. What do they all have in common? Well, number one, it's theism. Absolutely, they believe in God. Number two, it's context Bible revelation, that the Bible, the biblical story of creation, was given as a context. You have to understand it within its context. The problem when they debate between each other is, what is this context? So there's a lot of different families, and this is the number of them. Okay? What they're being attacked on is that, they're trying to fit their biblical interpretation based on the current scientific evidence. Because all of a sudden, within the last 50 to 100 years, okay, as biblical commentators, you were faced with scientific evidence that tells you, by the way, the universe is not only 7,000, 8,000 years old, it's 14 billion years old. Then you have to fit this time into your biblical interpretation. So then, the first group is called the gap theory. The gap theory came out about 50 years ago, and it fell out of favor. What is the gap theory? They tell you that, Genesis 1, when God created, says in the beginning, right? These are the opening words. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. From the perspective of the scholars that endorse this, they said, in the beginning, God created, in the beginning, everything was made. This was done about maybe 15 billion years ago, because the science tells us it's 15 billion years ago. But then, Genesis 1:2, there was a gap, because it says the earth was without form and void. And they attribute this gap, and I'll tell you this is a stretch, but this is their biblical interpretation, that because of the devil and Satan's fall, okay, he wreaked havoc and chaos on the earth. So God's creation, He came and messed it up. So then, for about billions of years, this was a gap. Until more recently, in our modern time, 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, God rearranged and recreated in the 6 days and restored to good the original creation. So that was the gap theory. That, yes, the universe was about 15 billion years old, but because of devil's work, it was messed up for all these billions of years until about 7,000, 8,000 years ago, which then matches with our biblical account, okay, of our understanding. So, it's 24 hours followed by a gap between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. It's billions of years. Death existed, yes, through Satan's work. The strength of the gap theory is actually one strength. When you look at the Hebrew verbs, you see that there is a change in the tense of the verb between Genesis 1 and Genesis 3. In Genesis 1 to 2, it's a perfect tense. In Genesis 3 and onwards, it's a narrative tense. However, modern biblical and Hebrew scholars take it that actually Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 is more of the title of what happened after that. And that's where there's a change in the tense. It's not that because something happened in the past, and then from there onward, the 6 days was a different account. Second group, called the day-age theory. And this is proposed by, one of the most prominent people in this area is Hugh Ross. Very, very, very prominent NASA scientist. This theory is that the age of the earth is billions of years, billion of time, day one. And then God created in 6 undefined periods. That's why it's called an age. The day represents an age. 6 unidentified periods which could be overlapping, and this could be billions of years until we come up to the current status. So, it is 6 periods of prolonged time, but not limited to 24 hours. The sequence may not necessarily be literal, but does not exclude it. So some of those, as I said, within these camps, you might find some fine-tuning. So some of them overlap, but days, some could overlap and some could not. Age of the universe, billions of years. Creation of Adam, however, is a special creation, instantaneous of age ex nihilo. So this is actually, I'll be honest with you, this is a view that I find a lot of our, Coptic Orthodox believers feel comfortable with. Because we do understand that it was from, and I'll actually show you some patristics writings about this. The patristics were actually relatively 2 camps. You had the camp of St. Basil and St. John Chrysostom, who were extremely prolific in this area. They're actually very, very, very much like young earth creationists. They do believe that was their interpretation, that it was 6 days, as is, the earth is young. And then you find on the other camp, somebody like St. Gregory of Nyssa. You find some few writings of St. Athanasius. You find some few writings of St. Cyril. Both of St. Cyril and St. Athanasius did not write much in this because they were more involved in the whole point of the incarnational theology. What does it mean to be on the image of God? And then St. Augustine. But you find those 2 camps. But in general, this is the view that a lot of us hold, that actually Adam is out of the picture. So the whole universe could have evolved in those billions of years, and those 6 periods are denoting 6 prolonged periods. Challenges of the day age is that if the days represent ages, a non-overlapping sequence does not match our current understanding of the universe. So if we are doing this interpretation to match the billions of years the universe has been around, well, does the sequence matter? Does the sequence matter? It does. If you're going to adopt a long, ancient universe, then the sequence, at least biologically, has to make sense, because you find, for example, Earth before the sun, and we know that didn't happen by what we know from cosmology. The vegetations, day 3 before the marine creatures, we know that is not what the biological theory does not hold to. Birds and marines created together. Hard to make sense of that. But then if you say, well, you know what, those were overlapping. There was not necessarily one day and then after the other. So basically, in a certain age, you had insects on which birds fed, and those birds had vegetation, so there was overlap in the time. So those come in sequence, but there's overlap, just like you see over here. But then how you make sense with so, the evening, and the morning of? Because it seems that the so, the morning, and the evening of gives you a little bit of a defining period, one thing after the other. If you are going to put an interpretation that want to expand it to the 15 billion years, you got to think a little bit about what does the sequence mean. And then you get the day gap theory. The day gap theory, John Lennox is a professor in Oxford. Amazing guy. He wrote a beautiful book called, I think, The First 7 Days. He believes that actually the days themselves were 24-hour periods, The days were 24-hour periods, but then between them, there was gaps of unidentified time. And his thought behind this is that actually in the day, like the first day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, God spoke of the creation. But then the creation came to fruition over the period of time. So then it is 24-hour period. Okay, so they are 6 24-hour periods, because then it would make sense, this is the morning and the evening of the first day, the second day, the third day. But in between, there are prolonged periods of time in between them. The age of the universe is billions of years. Creation of Adam is still special creation. It's kind of amazing when you look at an Oxford professor like that writing a book, really impressive when he talks about the creation of man. You know what? He still fully believes that creation of man was special creation, ex nihilo, instantaneous, and yes of age. And by the way, all these group of families, when it comes to death, they believe that death existed prior to fall, yes, for all creation, except for man. So animals, plants, all that, death did exist as part of the biological nature. But since mankind was a special creation out of nothing, instantaneous, 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, death did not exist until after sin and after fall. The pros and cons of the day gap. Number one, it preserves the integrity of the 24-hour period. Okay? That actually it does say, you know what, this is the evening and the morning of day 1, day 2 until day 6. So it preserves that. Number two, it preserves the concept of creation by fiat, which is basically that God spoke. God spoke. He said, "Let there be." And the creation started. And they base it also on that actually the days in Hebrew are not labeled first day, second day, third day, because when you look at those first, second, third day, you think of automatically like what? A week. But they're actually labeled day 1, day 2, day 3, which gives a sense of, you know what, those could be separate. Well, you know what, I did this in one day, and then in day 2, which is somewhere else, I did another thing. It's a bit of a tough argument, but that's one of the things that they do, or they interpret it on. Last camp, and this is where the fire will begin. So don't start throwing eggs or tomatoes. The group called which is the theistic evolution, but the figurative, which they believe in God and not naturalism, but natural laws. Natural laws, which what I mean by natural laws is like, you know what, if evolution is valid as a common ancestor and it took about 5 million years, okay. Scientifically, there is evidence for that. But they still believe in God. They are theists, okay? And they believe in the biblical revelation of creation, but they don't think it is literal. So this group, there is actually, within this group, 3 different camps. The first camp is what's called the framework. They say that creation as a story, as a narrative, was a framework because they say in the first 3 days, God created the atmosphere, the habitat, because in the first day He created the heavens and the earth. The second day, He created the water above and the water below. The third day, He created the plantation. And then on the second 3 days, so day 4, 5, and 6, He created the objects that inhabited this domain. So the first one was the heavens, day 1. And day 4, He created the sun and the moon to be in there. On day 3, He had the earth. Day 2, He had the sea. So in day 5, there is the fish, and then there is the birds up in the air. On day 3, He created the earth. So who inhabits the earth? The animals and the mankind. So hence you see this, what's called the parallelism. First 3 days, and then second 3 days. And it's not necessarily that it is a time sequence, it's what's called a topical sequence. So in some sense is that the concept of the week is more crucial to the understanding. It's logical and topic. Age of the universe, it's billions of years. Genesis is not all related. It's like they're telling us, like, you know what, Genesis doesn't even answer that question because Genesis is not talking about time. Genesis is talking about a framework of God logically creating the universe. It has nothing to do with the age of the universe. However, they would say that still Adam is a special creation and death did exist for animals and no for man. As I said, and here are the days. So day 1 is day and night, and then you got the inhabitants, which are the sun and the moon. Day 2 is the sky and the sea. Then you've got the sea creatures and the birds. Day 3 is the land, and you've got the land animals and the human. And they look at this in terms of what's called a kingdom model, because basically each king inhabits their kingdom. So the sun and the moon, their kingdom is the heavens, and the king is the sun and the moon. Okay? And then it comes all the way to land. Who are the creatures that are in this kingdom? Are the animals and the man. There is another very interesting interpretation about this, actually, that is within this framework, is that the author of the author of Genesis, Moses, took by God's Holy Spirit inspiration, took all the major gods that were worshipped by the neighboring civilizations and put them specifically in this framework as a created entity so that they would not worship it. This applies to the sun, applies to the moon, applies to the bird. Remember the Egyptians, they worship birds. Applies to the sea creatures, the dragon. Applies to animals. applies to the river, applies to the sea. So part of this was not necessarily to say how or when or the sequence of this creation, but rather that specifically was taking deities that were worshipped in the civilizations and make sure that the message gets that, you know what, God created them and created them in this sequence. It ties into the promise. This is another strength of this that they propose it, is that, you know what, just like God came after that in Genesis and Exodus, tied into the Israelites the idea of the promised land. He wanted to bring them to the point that, you know what, the promised land started even before that, in the creation, when the whole universe was created for who? Adam, or for mankind. And they bring this and they do a great comparison between the ancient civilization creation stories. And this is really, really tough sometimes to fathom this. But when you look at ancient Sumerian, Babylonian, Egyptian creation narratives, you'll find something very interesting. There are some similarities and some very, very striking dissimilarities. But some of the similarities are as follows. Is that in those similarities, man was created from dust. And in fact, in one of those, the Sumerian, it was said that God, the God, did spit on the ground and created mankind from the dust. Number two, it is common to say that that deity did breathe into mankind. Number three, believe it or not, in one of the ancient creation narratives, it is said that woman was created out of the side of man. But what is different between these creation narratives of Babylonian, Sumerian, and Egyptian cultures? There are some very, very important differences. Number one, in these creation narratives, there are multiple gods. In the Genesis, it's one God. Number two, in these creation narratives, it is the evil God who created mankind. Number three, in these creation narratives, mankind was created to serve the evil God. When you look at the Genesis account, the message is totally different. And the people who propose this framework theory would wonder and say, well, by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, did that allow Moses to use the language? The language was what? Creation out of dust. The language was what? That the woman came out of the side. And use that language, but to give a completely different theological message. That it was only one God. God created out of nothing, created for good, not to be a slave. And then they tie this with that the big message of the Torah is what? Is that if you stick with God, you'll come all the way to the promised land. And that started from day one when God created you. Because you also, and they make a very compelling case, I give you that. And some of these people who promote this are some of the most prominent Old Testament scholars in the evangelical church. So they make a very interesting thing. They say, look at the time of when the Torah was written. If we believe it as a time of the transition of the Israelites from Egypt going into Canaan, what did they leave back in Egypt and they're going into Canaan? It was absolute idol worshiping. And when they were in Egypt and they were going into Canaan, they must have heard, just living in the country, of creation stories from the competing civilizations, right? And at that time they were going into one of the most civilization that had a ton of idols, the Canaanite civilization. And the message at that time was given to them not necessarily in terms of how you were created in terms of biological scientific interpretation as we look at it, or the days as we look at them, but in terms of the theological message given to them. Hence the theological message that they're purporting is that God created the framework, and God created in a great sense, and He put each created creature in its own right domain as a creature, nothing to be worshipped. And then when you as mankind, you as the Israelites, stick to God, you'll make it to the promised land. Just like Adam, when he was created in glory, was in the promised land of his own, the Garden of Eden. But when he fell, he got kicked out of it. So this is an interesting one. However, what's against it, really, so it's a framework theory. What does it tell us about the historicity, the historical facts? And if now you've come down to the point that there are only 3 days, 3 in the beginning and 3 days, one and similar one, how do you fit this in? That in 6 days God made the heavens. They would come and tell you, look at the theology of the message, not the fine details as you're reading in the 21st century. Now, this is the last one, and this is the most controversial of all. This is purported by a guy by the name of John Walton, who is a professor of Old Testament studies in Wheaton, which is a very, 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 very strong evangelical seminary and school in Illinois. He says that it is a historical figurative that when God is making, or when the creation narrative was there, it is not talking about the material or biological origins of the creation, but it's talking about assigning it a function. And he basically bases it on the fact that, you know what, when in the Old Testament, you know the theology of giving a name. When God named Abraham, when God named Jacob, he gave them an identity. They did exist prior to that, but he gave them a new identity, and this identity is within serving the purpose of God. Hence, when God creates the light and the darkness, okay? And he names the light day and the darkness he names at night. He is not referring to their material existence, but he's giving them an identity. What is the identity of day and night? It's time. Time. Day 2, when he separated the water from below and the water from above, is he talking about the creation of the material entity, or is he giving it its identity of its function? And he said in day 2, it's creating the weather. Why? Because the weather is the creation of the cycles of rain and the cycles of water between the water on the ground and the water up there. On day 3, when he creates the earth and says the earth, let bring up the herbs and the plants, it's creation of food. So it is not a sequence, but it's rather a creation of time, weather, and food. And he basically makes this very simple analogy. He says as follows. When you are building a house, if you are a contractor, the way that you say you're building the house, well, you know what? I put the foundation, I put the walls, I put the first level, then I put the second level, then I put the windows, then I put the roof. That's how you build it. And then you can put a timeline as a contractor. Let's say you're an inhabitant of this house. And you would come and I would ask you, tell me the story of your house. What would you say? You're not going to say as the contractor, well, you know, we did the foundation this time, and then we put the foundation, we put the first level and the second level. No, what are you going to say? We moved into the house. We put our living room over there. We put our dining room over here. We put the kids' room up there. Because at that point, you're defining what? Identity, you're defining function, but you're not defining the origin and the existence and the material existence of that entity. And that's what he said, that's the difference between a house and a home. John Walton's theory comes down to one basic fundamental point. He says that Genesis 1 and 2 is not a story of the house in terms of creation, in terms of its material existence, in terms of its, when did we dig the foundation, when we put up the first floor or the second floor. It is a story of a home. When did it become functional? What does this mean? Well, his interpretation is very, very, very much with, an age of universe of billions of years. In terms of Adam, and I'll come to Adam actually in a little bit, that's actually a totally different story. But it could be ex nihilo, it could be instantaneous, it could be in a moment. It could be exactly as young earth creationists will believe it. But it also could be through a natural process. Adam and Eve are archetypal figures. What does that mean is that Adam, also the whole story of the house and the home, Adam was not identified as Adam, as the biblical text talks about it, until God gave him that identification. But it has nothing to do with his biological upbringing. Is this a creative way of interpretation? I think so, it is. But what is really important about this is that this interpretation by John Walton has become the adopted interpretation of the whole camp of theistic evolution. If you, I just mentioned to Francis Collins, okay, if you look at that website, biologos.com, that whole camp of theistic evolution adopted this interpretation. Are they, taking something that really appeals to them and saying, well, you know what, this is, what we like? Is this concordism? Could be. But what is John Walton getting all this from? He's done his homework. In fact, he's written 4 books talking about ancient civilization, ancient creation narratives, about the creation narrative of the world, and then Adam and Eve. His last one is Adam and Eve. And very, very interesting research there. And he says that basically it is giving the function and the role, not the existence. And in fact, he talks about that God created this universe so it would be he calls it the cosmic temple. That God created this to have an enjoyable relationship with Adam. And this whole purpose of this creation was that the Garden of Eden will be created while he will meet man. And man will meet God. And where does man meet God? In the temple. So he calls this whole creation the cosmic temple. And he makes it kind of based on Solomon when he dedicated the temple. But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain you. How much less this temple? And he says that the Garden of Eden was the meeting of God with man. Not gods, I'm sorry, this is a typo. But meeting of God with man. The strength of the historical figurative, very, very, very appealing from a biological standpoint of the creation of man. Except, who are Adam and Eve? I would preface by saying that Adam, yes, John Walton has some very strong argument who said that, Adam and Eve are Hebrew names, and if we realize that even if you retroject until 7,000 years prior, that the Hebrew language did not even exist. So how can you say that they had a name in a language that did not exist? I'm going to say it again. How can you say that those two people had a name in a language that did not exist? That is one of his claims. And in fact, he said that the Adam and Eve as a Hebrew word are a generic for man and mother of all living kind, which denote our description. Okay? Every man is a man. Every woman is representing female, which that every single mankind, every single living being had to come from a woman. So they represent them as a nature. But it's very problematic because then, is Adam and Eve historical figures? What is death? So creation of man is one of 3 options in these interpretations. Either special creation, which the young earth creationists and most of the old earth creationists would hold to, okay? Or miraculous modification, which is what the ID, the intelligent design, would hold to, that God at the right time did a certain modification of mankind to make him who he is. Or evolutionary creation, which is the theistic evolution camp. That basically God patiently waited for mankind to evolve from the biological process and mechanism called evolution until the point that he was intelligent enough to have a relationship with God. So those are the 3 camps. This is my last group of slides. And this is where it comes to be very, very, very controversial. Because no matter what you believe in terms of the creation of universe and you feel comfortable with that, when it comes to mankind, it becomes very hard to interpret because it's either one of 2 things. That mankind, in terms of the biblical Adam and Eve as we know it, is either 7,000 or 8,000 years old, okay? Or it is ancient, as biological ancestry population studies tell us that they're 150,000 years old. And now you're going to have to put on your biblical and theology hat and see these possibilities. First possibility, that they're a pair, they're 2. And by the way, the biological population studies tell you that based on our genetic diversity, it is mathematically impossible that all this diversity would have come from only a pair based on the mutation rate of genes. That is what a mathematical biologist and geneticist would tell you. So here are your options. Number one, that it's a pair of recent ancestors less than 10,000 years, which is the historical Adam and Eve, which is adopted by young earth creationists and progressive creationists. Option number two, a pair of recent representatives among humanity, because you can fathom that, well, you know what, you've got the population that tells you that they had to be 10,000 people. Those were the original ancestry of humanity based on our genetic diversity. So you can make a potential hypothetical solution that there is a group of humanity, and out of this humanity, God chose two who are Adam and Eve, and through those two, the biblical story starts. So that's the second possibility. But still, Adam and Eve per se are a historical pair among humanity less than 10,000 years. Option number three, you've got a pair, still a pair. So it would be true to the biblical story that they're a pair. But because of the genetic diversity and the way that we're looking at human genetic population, they have to be ancient, more than 150,000 years ago. Or a pair of ancient representatives among humanity. You all know when I talked about the bottleneck population, that was thought about 10,000 population in Africa about 150,000 years ago. By genetic modeling, that's what they think is the origin of mankind. So that's the fourth possibility. And the fifth, which is kind of interesting, that is adopted by several Catholic scholars and Russian Orthodox scholars, that this whole story of creation is symbolic of every one of us. And in fact, I was actually, talking to a couple of people. There is actually a couple of books in Egypt, in Arabic, from Jesuit scholars, okay, that talk about this, Henry Boulad and Coste Bandeli. They're actually, that's what they propose, that this is not a story of biological origins as much as a symbolic story of every one of us. So these are the 5 competing theories of Adam and Eve. Now, the theological challenge, no matter what stance you take, you're going to have to answer these questions in your mind. You have to do your research. You have to go back to your biblical studies. You have to go back to the people you discuss with and have to be honest with yourself. What does it mean to be created on God's image and likeness? Just like the question that was very appropriately mentioned, does the image and likeness mean our physical nature? Because if it does, it is incompatible with anything that Adam could be more than 7,000 to 8,000 years. If image and likeness is God's spirit in you, it's your free thinking, is your creative will, then biologically, you could have evolved in whatever shape you have evolved, and at the right time in history, God breathed the spirit on you, and that spirit is the image and likeness of you knowing God. That is the more liberal interpretation, as I said, from some Catholic scholars and Russian Orthodox scholars. But number one, what does it mean to be on God's image and likeness? Number two, how does God participate in our creation at this point after Genesis? Believe it or not, the same debate of how God created us is the same debate, how does God interfere in your own creation at this point? Can anyone tell me? Because if you would say, well, God at this point, I'm born from my mom and dad. A sperm and an ova came together and I am there. It's a biological process. And then this is where the body comes from. But what about the spirit? Is the spirit a biological phenomena or not? Well, if it is not a biological phenomena, okay, and listen to this, is very tough. When does God put the spirit in the embryo? And does God put the spirit in the embryo? And if God creates the spirit in each single embryo, is it created in a sinful state or an innocent, unsinned state? If you'd say it is not in a sinful state, well, how can we say that we are born with the corrupt nature? If God creates us in our own, that's me, if God creates me with the sin, well, really, is that what God does? That's impossible to believe. So the whole creation tension about the body and spirit, and knowing that the body can come from biological means, and the spirit comes from God, even comes to the point of us being created. How does the spirit come to each one of us? How does the sin come to each one of us? And a very simple answer that a lot of people say, well, you know what? God creates the spirit free of sin, but then the body is where the sin is. But you know what? This is the Gnostic philosophy. Gnosticism, that matter is evil, but the spirit is from God and has no evil. That's problematic. So believe it or not, within Christian bioethics, there is a ton of debate that has lasted for centuries, revolving around this point. How does God create us at this point? Is it totally a biological phenomena? Or does God interfere at this point in every single creation in this world? And I can tell you, the debate between Christian scholars is on both sides. But it comes back to the point that you would see that a Christian scientist who would believe that man evolved from biological precursors, and God breathed the spirit of life on them at some point, and that was God's spirit, not the biology. They would believe that actually, I don't see anything wrong with the conclusion that we are, when we're born, we're born through this natural biological process, and then we get the spirit from God at some point. So you see how your understanding of creation even comes to the point of where you're at now. Number 3, how does sin get transmitted from generation to generation? And then how do you interpret death? How do you interpret death? So how you interpret death is very clear, because you know what? So here are the people that, like in the young earth creationists, they would say, well, you know what? It was a spiritual death and a physical death. The people on the figurative side, they would say, well, when God said, when you eat of the tree, you shall die. Did Adam die? Right there? No. So they would claim, well, it is spiritual death, which is expulsion from the Garden of Eden, not physical death. Hence, mankind was not created immortal. Hence, death as a potential possibility could have existed prior to fall. Sometimes this feels for us really strange, but then they would be the very first to argue with you. If man was created immortal, why was there a need for the tree of life? So then it becomes a little bit more nuanced. Was man created immortal, or was man created with a potential of immortality? And it becomes very hard, because you know what? If you take the theistic evolution, who said that man evolved and death existed, the people before me all were dead, and then the people around me, let's say I'm a representative among the whole humanity, could have died. Why were Adam and Eve chosen? They would tell you, well, you know what? The Bible has a story of the chosen people. He has a story of Abraham. So God could have chosen at that time, and that's actually John Walton's viewpoint. I don't buy it that much, but I think it's very creative. That he would say that out of mankind, when mankind evolved from 150,000 years to the point of 8,000 years, when they were intelligent enough, spiritual enough, understanding enough, God chose a pair called Adam and Eve among humanity at that point. And he asked them to be representatives of humanity, to bring God to this group, to bring order, to bring harmony, to bring relationship. And they were given a chance of immortality by their access to the tree of life. However, because they sinned and they wanted to become on their own, and they wanted to become gods in their own eyes, they were not given access to the tree of life. Hence, biological mortality, which was in them before, reigned in them. And because of this, they lost the chance for all humanity to be, at that point, part of the Garden of Eden. Do I think this is very creative? I think so. But that's how he interprets it. Last slide. If you would go with the group ancestry that mankind was 150,000, here are the challenges that you have to answer in your Bible. What do you make of the genealogies of Adam in Genesis 7 and Luke 3? By the way, Luke 3 traces Jesus Christ all the way to whom? To Adam. So if you think it was a group and it was not just a historical Adam, there was not a single Adam and a single Eve. If you think it was a group of people and Adam and Eve were representative of a group of people, how do you make sense of these genealogies? They don't make sense at that point. It becomes very hard to incorporate them. How do you make sense of Genesis 2:5? Before any plant of the field was in the earth, and before any herb of the field had grown, for the Lord had not caused it to rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground. I find this verse very hard to reconcile with John Walton's theory of Adam and Eve being representatives of humanity who were chosen by God to be in the Garden of Eden and lead people into Garden of Eden. I find it very hard because you know what? It's clear from this verse that there was no other man. There was no other humanity. How do you make sense of Acts 17 that it says in here, from one man he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth? But I'll give you this, and I was talking to Dr. Haney about this. Actually, in the Greek language, in the Greek text, the original text, which, you know, this is how hard it is, that sometimes you have to go into the Greek to learn the reality. The word man does not exist. It's actually from one. He made all the nations of the earth. Hence, you find some Bibles, like the King James Bible, like the RSV, would actually say from one blood, he made all mankind. You find the NIV, the NASB, and a lot of other Gospels, their translations, would say from one man. But you can see how one word can make it very difficult to interpret. Because if it's one blood, well, you know what? Yeah, we all share the same blood. And that could match, a group ancestry could match 150,000 years ago of 10,000 people to be the ancestry. But from one man, that's hard to argue against. But that tells you how hard it is. And then this is above all, the toughest of all. How do you make sense of Romans 5:12? I'm not telling you that these people are dishonest in their research, but I'm telling you that they have to struggle with these verses. And if you adopt their interpretation from the Catholic liberal side or the liberal Orthodox side, like in Russia, or John Walton, these are the verses you're going to have to make sense of. When it says, therefore, just as sin entered through the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. When you read John Walton's book, and he's such an amazing scholar, he says, well, yeah, you know what, I can understand this, because for me, Adam was a representative. And as a representative, okay, when he sinned, unfortunately, he prevented all humanity from access to the tree of life. So after that point, death, but it says death entered, okay, but at this point, he say, well, death at that point was established. There was no chance of it reversing until Jesus Christ came. But then how do you go into 1 Corinthians chapter 15? The first man, Adam, became a living being, and the last Adam, a life-giving spirit. But John Walton and people like him would be first to say, well, guess what? Christ was not the last Adam. This is figurative speech. So what he's saying over here is that not the first humankind sinned, because the last human, life-giving spirit, Christ is not the last human. But it says that in us, in the origin, when we created, okay, we sinned. The first man sinned. And in the origin of our nature, that sin existed, and that's why Christ came. But then you'll ask the question, well, Professor Walton, you're saying that there's a possibility from a biological standpoint that humanity existed for 150 years, okay? And they went through biological death generation after generation for 150 years, 150,000 years. And then about 7,000 years ago, which is considered the biblical time, all right? At that point, God chose Adam and Eve as representatives for humanity to have that relationship with humanity. What was the status of the rest? Were they judged? Were they sinful? Did they die? What happened to them? What is their status? Where is even Christ from them? Where is God for them? And he would cite, and I think this is really a bit of a stretch, but he would cite Romans 5:13. To be sure, sin was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not charged against anyone's account where there is no law. From his perspective, he says that the people who lived prior to Adam, so from 150,000 years until to 7,000 years, were not held accountable for their sins because there was no law and there was no communication from God. The people who lived with Adam at that 7,000 years were not held accountable because of that. Because there was no law. But then once humanity got the revelation from God in the form of God's Spirit who gave to Adam, humanity became accountable. I think that's a big stretch. I think it's very hard to reconcile. I think if you look at the end, at the lay of the land here, you have the historical literal and you've got the historical figurative. I believe if we're really honest to the text, we would have to admit that God has a certain kind of special something. I don't want to jump and call it creation or evolutionary creation, because you know what, just like somebody else said in the beginning, we can play with terms, whatever we want to fit our own agenda. But there is no doubt in my mind, a special thing about humanity. And there's a special thing about sin in humanity, and there's a special thing about being distanced from God in humanity, whether it is spiritual or physical. And there's a special thing for that has happened. Otherwise, why would Christ need to come? That is the whole point of Paul's epistles to Romans. Why would he need to come? So, is this easy to convince somebody outside of the church? No, it's not. It's very hard. And that's why I think the first lecture, the one that we had earlier today, is for people outside of the church. But this lecture is for people around, for here, who actually read the Bible and want to make sense with the Bible. But then you have to determine, you remember that analogy I gave of the railroad? Okay? You can go and study your science and make up your mind from a scientific standpoint, and that will be one track of the railroad. But then you have an equal and arduous task to come on your biblical side and your theological side and match them. If you believe that God created Adam in a special creation, then I think it would be very, very hard to reconcile it biologically with man evolving from precursors. If you think that God gave the Spirit to mankind at a time in man's history when they had biologically evolved from precursors, then that would be more plausible for you. But then you have solved the problem in Genesis. You have not solved the problem in Romans. And I think this is where John Walton's book becomes really a problem. John Walton focuses so much on Genesis that he wants to resolve the conflict in Genesis between the Genesis account and evolution and creation. But then from a theological standpoint, you have to come and ask him, well, it's like, Professor Walton, what do you think then of the need of Christ? Why did Christ come? Why did Christ's blood was there? Why did the sacrificial system that was based on a symbolic sense to bring the sacrifice of Christ, why was it needed? You have to tie in your Old Testament and your New Testament. As I said, and I will, have to admit this because a lot of people ask me this, I think from a biological standpoint, there is a lot of evidence of evolution from common ancestry. I think the mechanism is still very debatable, whether it is absolutely completely random mutation or intelligent design. And in all honesty, when you look at the science, I think the science is out there for both of them. And this is from the scientific standpoint. But I do believe from a theological and a biblical standpoint, there is a special status of creation of mankind. I believe that the link between both of them is yet to be revealed to us. We might know it one day when we're in this side of heaven. We might never know it until we get up there. But in the end, it's not shaking my faith that God still, despite the mechanism might differ, God created it all, created for good, and created man for glory. My urge to you at the end of this talk, if you are struggling with the scientific aspect of evolution, and to the point that it seems to you that it's implausible to believe otherwise, that man has evolved from precursors or common ancestry, I would tell you very, very much like so that you are in a company of some very, very prominent scientists and prominent Christian theologians who are struggling with the same debate. Go and read their work and get oriented. But in the same time, read the opposing view. One thing you would realize from my presentation, I gave you both views because we have to respect and learn both views. I think if you want to hear a little bit more about our tradition as a church has been primarily that the creation, the universe, definitely can follow the outlines of what science is telling us. But when it comes to man, there is a certain mystery that we just don't know enough about. And I think the mystery is not only in his biology. I think it is in his spirit, in his sense, in his mind, in his intelligence, in his creativity, in his emotions, in his relationship. It is unbelievable, and it's so complex. And I think this is where God's image is unbelievable. So go and do your reading, and don't stumble because you can't fit them both together. Know you are in a good company of that. And don't let anyone who would come and tell you, if you would endorse evolution as a biological standpoint, you cannot believe in God. I don't think that's true. I think science is amazing in the mechanism. I think faith is amazing in its revelation. And to be a complete person, you have to put both in the same part. I take that the special creation is very special. I'm going to skip over these, but I had some scripts from the church fathers. The church fathers are a little bit hard in this, and you got to give them a break because they didn't know in terms of a lot of the science that we have. But the church fathers, as I said, there are two groups. Saint Basil and Saint John Chrysostom are very much in favor of the young earth creationist. Saint Gregory of Nyssa, Saint Augustine, maybe Saint Athanasius, but I'd probably say Saint Gregory of Nyssa and Augustine are more of the day age, where the universe is prolonged periods of time. But I do believe that both of them believed very strongly in creation, special creation of mankind. If you want to have a very, very, very good book that really goes into the patristics of this from an Orthodox standpoint, there's a book by Father Seraphim Rose. It's that thick. And he goes into details very much about the patristic writings in this. Thank you for your time. So just as a favor, whoever's going to ask a question, please stand up. Okay? All right, there's a couple, okay, sorry. I'm actually, while we're taking the question, I'm going to put the other presentation of the books so you guys can, if you want to take some names. Okay, this question.
I was just going to ask, could it be that God deliberately introduced these different viewpoints so that we could come together today and debate them?
Would you believe that I just mentioned this yesterday to one person, is that I think that the richness and the mystery in the biblical text is such amazing that it would not give any one of us a claim that I can tell it all and I can, interpret it, this is the only way. I think there is such a kind of mystery, not vagueness, mystery in the text that allows us to come and debate such entity. And I don't think this means that it's vague as much as it is a mystery and it's rich. And yes, it allows different interpretations. And I don't think these interpretations have to be mutually exclusive in themselves. I think a lot of people on the other side struggle with the point, okay, what is truth? I think the truth in the biblical text is what we take out of it, that God created and created for good. I think the details of how and when are definitely a mystery. And to me, you're absolutely right. That mystery allows a richness of interpretation that we can come and even discuss it. So yes, if it was that simple and that easy, I think people would have said, you know what, I know it all. Yes. Okay, there's a... Okay, you've got the microphone, okay.
Sorry, guys. Thank you, George, for the great talks. My question is a very long question about young earth creationists and what they believe in. So that you said that they can't have animals and humans can't be immortal at the same time because then they'd eat the plant and the plant would die. But that's not really what we observe, because from biology we know that fruits, the only reason for fruits is that they are eaten to move the seed to a different place to plant a new plant. And we know that plants evolve to have different kinds of seeds so that they're either small enough so that you don't break the seeds, or that they have a shell. So we know that like it can exist. Animals and humans can be vegetarians and not kill the plants. That's not death of the plant. And can I finish?
Yes.
Okay. Second part is an explanation from my point of view about a few things like the fossil record and the Grand Canyon. And you said the age of whether Adam and Eve can be the only two people chosen from a lot of people at the time, and that is Noah's flood. You know, it explains all of that. It doesn't matter whether Adam and Eve are the two people that were from among millions, because everybody dies and we start again from 6 people, 12. And that explains the Grand Canyon. We know that the Grand Canyon is formed when the river basically digs through the layers of rock. But what if it happened in a very fast-paced, which a lot of people believe, which probably are the young Earth creationists, that it was a flood, so there was a lot of water, and it had to go somewhere, so it dug itself through the Grand Canyon, and that's how we have the Grand Canyon. And so that explains the fossil records as well, because a lot of animals are not going to be on the ark, therefore they're going to be, dead.
Okay, so I'm going to answer just a couple of things. First of all, when I'm presenting these views, I'm not saying I personally endorse these views, but for the sake of argument, I think the point about the young Earth creationists is not only the point about mortality or immortality of the animals or plants. I think the point of how they bring in the evidence from the universe being 14 billion years old into the point that it was all created within 6,000 to 7,000 years. I'll say a second thing. Most people who, like John Walton, and people who believe that, Christians who believe that the population is about 150,000 years old, would struggle with Noah's flood. Absolutely. And most of them would interpret Noah's flood in terms of it being a regional flood in the earth at that time where the people of the biblical story lived. I do believe that is problematic, because the Bible doesn't tell us. The Bible tells us that it was on the face of the earth, okay? But that's what they struggle with, and that's when they, pay attention to Noah's flood, because like, if you can't solve this diversity from Adam's time 7,000 years ago, how would you even solve it from Noah's time? Okay? It becomes even harder. But then they would probably say at that point that it's a regional flood, something like the tsunami that we've seen in modern days, okay? The point about the Grand Canyon, and that has been proposed, there's been a lot of research in this area, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not well versed in this particular part, but I can tell you that very few scientists from a geological standpoint buy in to the young Earth creationist viewpoint about the flood being that fast and how it made the Grand Canyon. It doesn't change the fact that the fossils that were there, when they date them by the radioactive dating, date to millions of years, almost up to 1 billion. So the flood can answer the shape of the Grand Canyon, but it cannot answer the ancient age of the fossils. So I think the young Earth creationists have several arguments that are against them. I believe the most simplest of them is the age of the universe, based on what we see on galaxies and stars that by light years appear so old and away from us. If you theologically then answer that God created with the appearance of age, that is a theological answer, not a scientific answer. Okay? Next question. Okay, so whoever has the mic, just give it to them and then let's go one by one. You want one this side? Okay, that's okay. All right, you can.
Thank you. My question is, you talked yesterday about God wanting to make a relationship or to have a relationship with the human beings, okay? What I see is only what I have in the Old Testament is that God is making this relationship with only the Israelites, people of Israel, okay? So what about the other religions? What about the other, people who are in Native America, for example? Those people never heard of God of Israel. So isn't it not fair that he will, choose some kind of people to give them his message only? Right?
That is a very tough question to answer. But you have to look at it from multiple different senses. I think when you look at the biblical text and be very truthful to it, God did not choose the Israelites from the get-go or from the beginning. But in fact, when you look at actually how, and we have very limited information what the Holy Spirit gave to us in the first 10 chapters of Genesis. But you can clearly see a pattern that from day one, evil existed and evil was really rampant and evil was taking out people. You see from the second generation of Cain killing his brother. And that existed all the way until the flood. And that's the point of what God said in terms of the flood, because of the evil of man. You come to the point of even when he allowed them to exist and they built the Tower of Babel, the evil was rampant. And you look at how God was trying through this big plan of design to allow in the fullness of time that Christ would come to redeem us, to give us the knowledge of the Father, to give us the chance to have that relationship. When you think about it from this context, if God, all the humanity was just going on its own and doing whatever they wanted to do, whether it was from a religious standpoint and believing in what they wanted to believe in, even the Israelites who God chose, they battled so much idol worship and they battled so much with polytheism. So even those, so just imagine the other people around them. So I don't think God was preferentially not choosing the others, but he had to focus on a group of people until he would come and incarnate and change from inside out the human nature. Because until that point, the human nature could not comprehend and could not follow God. And that's what St. Paul talks about in Romans, is that, you know what, the sin that I didn't want to do, I still did. And that was the point of prior to the incarnation and prior to the Holy Spirit, that despite their best effort, they could not keep up with the relationship at least. What is God's judgment on the people that are outside of the chosen people of Israel? I think the least we have to say is that we don't know. At least we have to say. And the least we have to say is two things. Is that for those specific people, Paul wrote the verse in Romans, for those who did not have law, it was not counted for them. Because you know what? They had no law that was given to them. And they were law for themselves. That's number one. Number two, we have to realize if we who are limited and evil human beings have a little bit of mercy on such people, just imagine the infinite and merciful God. The bottom answer, I don't know. But I think from the flip side, why did God choose such a group? Because when you have to prepare a group to the point that they can accept Christ when he comes, that group has to be prepared. That group has to be given prophecies. That group has to be given a sense of monotheism. If you look at it from actually a religion standpoint, and people who have studied anthropology will be able to tell you that. But at the time of Jesus Christ coming, the Jewish people were the only people that stuck by a monotheistic belief. Even in ancient Egypt, in a very short period of time, the monotheism did not last. The problem, if Christ came in a polytheistic society, he would have been accepted, but he would have been accepted as one of many. And his message would have not been fulfilled. There is something very interesting when you think about how God would have to choose a group of people that would be strictly monotheist to accept Christ as a redeemer. And yes, although they struggled with the Jews who looked at it and a monotheism from a different perspective, but at least they were monotheistic. But if he came at a time when it was like Athens, well, you know what? We're going to make you a statue, just like all the other statues we have up on Mars Hill. So that in of itself, when you look at it, it is such amazing how to find the timing. There's in fact some very interesting research about this, about how the timing of when God would have for the first time in the history of human civilization a language that at least 2/3 of the known world will be able to converse with, the Greek language. If it was like 300 years prior to that, that language was not widespread, but you went through the Greek invasion through Alexander and then the Greek colonies, okay, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, and those actually, the Greek culture and language was adopted because when the Greek was used as the language to write the Bible, it was transmitted very quickly. You wait until politically, until you've got something called the Roman Empire, who has such dominance on the world and has established transportation and established a piece of transportation called the Pax Romana, where people can travel from one place to one place, so that you put all these combinations together, and in a matter of 30 years, more than 2/3 of the known civilization has heard of Christ. You talk about the fullness of time, it's pretty impressive. Pretty impressive. So that, I think, these are steps that God was preparing. Yes? So let me just take one from the side there, and then I'll come to you. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the pre-fall state of humanity and post-fall. And I've heard another proposal, and I'll read a few verses from Genesis 3 that go along with this, which is, as the fall was happening, so starting from verse 17, then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree, and he continues saying, cursed is the ground, and you shall toil in the sweat of your face. And then he says, and Adam called his wife's name Eve, because she was the mother of all living. Also for Adam and his wife, the Lord God made tunics of skin and clothed them. Then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us, capital us, to know good and evil. And now, and then it continues. And I've heard a proposal that the tunics of skin are not like animal skin, but rather bringing the pre-fall human into the evolved order of creation at a certain point in time, or certain, I don't know what words to use at this point, but bringing...
Pre-fall human beings, you're saying.
Yeah, bringing pre-fall human beings and creating an exceptional being as human, but taking the form of man.
I would tell you that it's very creative. I think it all comes down to the point that when you look at fall, you have to really answer the question before fall, what it is. You have to answer the question, how do you believe Adam was created? And did death exist prior to fall? Because depending on those two questions, you can answer what fall is. Okay? I think this is a creative way. I find it hard from the text to read that. Okay? I think from the text, it is clear that Adam was created in a very good state. That's what the Bible tells us. I think Adam was given a potential to become immortal, and that's why the tree of life existed. I think Adam had a relationship with God, and then Adam sinned and lost that opportunity. And because of that, we were all condemned not only to die, but to lose that relationship. And that relationship was not restored until our Lord Jesus Christ. Adam pre-fall was with God in this perfect relationship in the Garden of Eden. Whether the Garden of Eden, you take it as an absolutely physical, material place, or a state, it's the paradise state, you can debate that. But in either case, he was in a perfect relationship with God. And it could have continued on with the tree of life. Yes? Okay, go ahead. You've got the microphone. Whoever has the microphone, you go ahead. I can't see from here.
Thank you again. I thanked you yesterday for the kind of whirlwind history tour we had of all that philosophy of religion and science. Today I have a comment about that the tour of all the different Christian scientific camps and how you evaluated how they thought about evolution. That was really impressive. Thank you. My comment is, so 2,000 years ago, if you were living at that time, around the time the Bible was being written, and you peered into the future and you saw today the science that we have to inform all these theories, you would be absolutely shocked. I mean, beyond shocked to see how much progress you've made. 2,000 years from now, I can't even imagine what we'll have. Maybe we'll have time travel. We might be traveling across space. The point is, it seems limitless, the scientific advancement that humans are capable of. And the more we advance, the more theories we might come up with. We might negate half of these. We might come up with another 1,000. Who knows what will be popular 2,000 years from now? It seems the cycle is limitless. And not only that, the writers of the Bible at the time, obviously, they had no idea about all the science that we're using today to inform these theories. Not only that, they were writing at a time where often the intent was not to be to put together a factual record of history. Often the intent was to influence, to teach a lesson, a moral. Even Jesus spoke in parables. The characters in his parables probably weren't real, but that's not the point. The point was to teach us a lesson. So what if we're getting it all wrong the way we're reading the Bible in the first place? Maybe the point is not to match it up with evolution. Maybe it's not trying to teach us anything about history or what happened or the truth in that sense. What if the whole point of Christianity is just to live the way Jesus did, and it doesn't matter how the world was created? Maybe we'll just leave that up to the scientists.
Right, but to argue with that point is that you'll kind of take now, if you want to live the way that Lord Jesus Christ lived, you'll take the New Testament, but then you'll find a lot of debate about what Genesis is. To your point, this is exactly the argument that the young earth creationists would say, is that we shouldn't be looking at scientific theories, because if we stick too much to scientific theory, tomorrow it might change totally. But that's the same argument that somebody who uses the framework theory and more of the functional creation, like John Walton, that it says, what the Bible is giving a theological message, it's giving a parable, not giving scientific details. Because then this parable and this message is timeless and is not tied in with any scientific findings that could change. Because you find like the day gap, the day age, and the day period, what are they trying to do? They're trying to match the period of time with billions of years. But let's say, we come up in 200 years from now, and it's trillions. What if it's 10,000 years? Maybe we find out our old science is completely wrong. So you've worded it in a wrong sense, but then the people who are not doing this tying with science are like the young earth creationist, who's taken it at face value, or somebody that is using the framework theory or the functional creation. Because what they're emphasizing is the message behind creation, not the scientific details. Okay, next question.
So the Bible says that a day with the Lord could be 1,000 years. Now, for the days of creation to be a 6-day, 24-hour period, that might be a wrong interpretation, because if we say that a day with the Lord is 1,000 years, then the scientific evidence that the creation happened in 6,000 to 7,000 years might be true based on biblical evidence. What do you think on that? What's your thought?
So when you say that the day of the Lord is 6,000 years, so we'd say the 6 days of creation are 6,000 years, then you add on top of them the age of humanity, which is another 6,000, so it would be about 12,000? Is that what you're saying?
No, if creation happens in 6 days, then wouldn't that be like 6,000 years?
Okay, so just like also the figurative language, when you say the day of the Lord is like 1,000 years, okay? By the way, God does not have days, and He doesn't have years. The point of this simile is that God is outside of our time. When we think of God in terms of constrained by time, constrained in our own natural time, God is outside of time. So I can't really take this and extrapolate and say, well, the day is 1,000 years, hence the 6 days are 6,000 years. Because then I will fall into the same problem. Well, what do you do about the scientific age of the universe? Okay? So this is basically what this is telling me when I look at it from a biblical standpoint, is that number one, God is above time. He's not constrained by our timeline for things to happen. Because we could be patiently waiting, and in that context, when it was written in Peter, it was basically that he was trying to tell them, you know what, you're going to put your timeline with God. God doesn't go by that timeline. You're going to tell God is like, deliver me in several days. You know what? He doesn't go by that timeline. He acts based on His own will that is not timed by us. So I cannot take that simile and say the days of creation are 6,000 years. You see my point? Okay, next question.
Yeah, you have brought here 5 theories or 5 scenarios. It might be 2 bears, how they brought Adam and Eve 150,000 years ago. But my question is, if God created Adam in His image, and He created first animals and plants in a paradise, plants and animals had the ability to multiply and exist. So I think the key point to even resolve that is where or when this exists. So if I said Adam was created alone, as the Bible said first, and God let him live in His image, God is everlasting life. So I would say Adam is everlasting life too, right?
I disagree, and I'll let you finish, but I disagree.
First, I would say, I would take the theory of what if, I don't know if they take it here or not. So he then sees that Adam need Eve as a helper, and he has no other way to multiply or live, because there is no way to multiply. He must live forever in order to live with God in paradise. Have they thought about this? Like, what if Adam was created first to live, not to die, so he had fallen in spiritual and physical death once he sinned? You know what I mean?
Okay, so I'm gonna, I don't fully know if I understand your question. However, let me try to answer, and then we'll discuss.
Okay.
First of all, I kind of disagree a little bit that Adam was created immortal. I think that Adam had a potentiality, but he was not created inherently immortal, because there's only one immortal being, who's God. If Adam was created immortal, why was the need for the tree of life there? That's number two. Number three, I don't think that the Bible is telling us that Adam's way of immortality was through population, through relationship with Eve. I think God had the tree of life. That was the way of immortality. Number four, I think you're also looking at the point of where do you mix figurative language with literal language? So the tree of life, was it a tree that actually just you eat the fruit and you become immortal, or was it a gift given by God at that point to become immortal? I think your point of where do you define fall is very, very, very important. And that was exactly the points I mentioned. How do you define creation? How do you define fall? But I kind of disagree. I don't think Adam was created inherently immortal, because God cannot create an immortal being, because only God is immortal. Okay? Next question. I don't know who has the microphone.
I have a couple of questions. First question that I have regarding the levels of diversity that humans you were talking about. I don't really understand what you mean by levels of diversity. I know that the past 200 years, the past 2 centuries, that the population growth went from like 1 billion to 7 billion.
Okay.
That's
Can I answer this question, because we put it in the previous lecture, so it was mentioned. So what it is that they found in the genetic composition of humanity, there is a change in a certain gene, okay? Based on this change in this certain gene that is witnessed in the current population, the time that it takes for a new copy of this gene to come up, and they look at the current diversity of this gene specifically, when they mathematically do the population mathematics, okay, they come up with a model that is about 150,000 years old, and it comes and nails down to actually about 10,000 people. I am not saying this is what it is. I'm saying that this is a scientific theory and based on this genetic diversity. So I'm not talking about, well, we've got some, African American people, we've got some Asian people, we've got some Caucasian. It's not about how we look. It's actually about a genetic change that happens on a certain frequency. And based on that frequency, if you take that the law of that frequency is changing, I mean the frequency of the change is constant, and you multiply it by years back, they will come up 150,000 years. So that's what they're proposing. Okay?
the other questions that I have. Somebody who's actually streaming this is asking those questions. Many studies have shown that the radiometric dating is not accurate. For example, a living snail was dated to be 27,000 years old, where it should have been 0 since it's still alive.
Okay, can I answer this, because actually we also did the full lecture on that last time. So I think it would be very naive if we generalize radiometric dating, okay, to say that all of it is invalid. Yes, there have been some instances where specific experiments were not valid, but to generalize that the whole radiometric dating is invalid is not right. Number two, you have to use the right radioactive isotope, because not all the isotopes are the same. There are isotopes that their half-life is only 5,000 years. There are others that are 1 billion years. You have to use the right isotope. Okay? Number three, they have collaborated this radioactive dating with tree growth ring as well as volcanic eruptions. So I truly believe, based on my understanding, I'm not a geologist, okay, and I'm not in nuclear physics, but based on the reading, the evidence for radioactive dating, for most part, is relatively accurate. I would not take one experiment to invalidate the whole field of science. Next question. Okay. So let's take some from the front here.
Kind of going off of what you said before, could it be that the message given about Adam and Eve has two simultaneous meanings? Like, it means Adam and Eve, and then you should follow it chronologically, like, for 7,000 years, and at the same time, it means creation of man and woman, like, in general?
So what you're saying is that there could be two messages. There is a, like what we call an archetypal, so it is kind of like, this is the symbol, or this is of humanity, this is all of us, okay? But also those are historic people. To some extent, somebody like John Walton will adopt a vision like that he would say that Adam and Eve do two roles. They are a type for all humanity, okay? Because through them, for example, we know that men and women, okay, live together. And also through Adam, we know that mankind sins. So as a type, he represents all of us. But also in the same count, there are historical figures who actually existed. So it could be both. That would be somebody like John Walton will adopt something like this. I guess the problem is when you adopt that they are a type, they represent all of us, how can you reconcile this with the New Testament? Like the verses that I mentioned in the New Testament, okay? If they're just a symbol, how do you reconcile it with Romans 5:12? So I think this is where you're going to have a whole cohesive biblical interpretation of your theology. Yes?
How is there being death before Adam and Eve, or, you know, how is there being death before man existed? How is that compatible with, you know, a good God? Like, why would he, you know, create his creation with flaws from the beginning?
That's a really good question, and that's actually one of the questions that people who adopt, for example, a theistic evolution versus intelligent design. I guess you would know very well by this presentation now is that it all depends on which camp you fall in, okay? If you are within the theistic evolution camp, who believe that death is part of biological nature, okay, they would come and tell you that the system overall is very good. Even though within the system, there are parts of the system that include with it death. You would look like in even the creation of the universe, okay, you look at the supernovas, you look at stars that become extinct, okay, but the whole system is good. And they would come and ask you, how do you define good? Good means a beautiful creation that we're living in, even though that it carries within it death. So from a theistic evolution, they would not equate very good as equal to death. But on the other side, if you are a young earth creationist, they would think of good as being immortal. And they have a hard time. So that's why, for example, in their interpretation, death happened only after sin, because it was a consequence of sin. Because God, when He created all very good, He was created for the potentiality of being immortal. So I guess the answer to your question depends on which camp would you be more of. Okay? Yes.
So, thank you for, there was one question I had, I think you answered that, or one comment that I wanted to make, that the idea of immortality, we're not, nothing in creation is immortal by nature. I think that's something that might divide us from some Western ideas of theology, where they struggle with that. The Church Fathers, I think, were very clear. We partake of God's immortality, that's how we become immortal, but we don't become immortal by our very own nature. Two other issues. I don't know if you addressed this, but a lot of people mentioned that there's two different creation stories between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And the other thing, the idea behind guided randomness, many people have believed that God endowed nature with a certain free will, but that doesn't take away His divine providence and plan, similar with how we explain our free will and divine providence. So I was wondering if you can comment on those.
So the two creation narratives, it has been extremely well studied and like PhD thesis, books have been written a lot about like the creation narrative of one and the creation narrative of two, because actually there is a bit of a discrepancy between them. And some of them come and point that, well, you know what, when Moses wrote those, he had prior sources, and there was something called the P document and the J document, because in the first one, God's referred more as Jehovah. The second one, God is referred to mostly as Elohim, okay? There's all these, a lot of scholarly activity about this. I think the fundamental point is that actually there is a difference between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 in something. Genesis 1, God is giving us the big picture of the universe. Genesis 2, God is giving us what's happening with Adam. Because in Genesis 2, we start to find that God has endowed Adam with the point of like, have domain, start to name them. Start to name them means that you're a steward on them. So it's telling him what are you supposed to do. In Genesis 2, we're actually also starting to see the relationship between Adam and Eve. About, she is flesh from my flesh and bone from my bones. You don't see that in Genesis 1. So while Genesis 1 talks more about the cosmology and the universe and the earth, and Adam is only mentioned like for 2 or 3 verses, in Genesis 2 you find almost the whole chapter about it. So without going too much into details about the sources and where it came from and whether it's Moses, because like when people see these two different narratives, they say, well, you know what, Moses didn't really write it. Actually, somebody came in the 6th century before Christ and put these just pieces of the puzzle together and said this is Genesis. I don't think so. But I can clearly see that with the guidance of the Holy Spirit, Moses is giving messages in each one of them. The first one is you in the big picture. Second message is you and God is relationship with you. So that's the first question. The second question, sorry, what was the second one? Remind me. Free will. So I don't necessarily believe that randomness of nature is a free will, because it's so random and it's not a choice. It just happens. When you get a random mutation, you end up with cancer. It's not that nature chose to give you that. I think free will has to be tied in with an intelligence. I have yet to find within nature, inside of it, an intelligence. So I think there is a bit of randomness, but also there is a bit of free will for us as the intelligent creatures to be part of this. But I don't think it's inherent within nature. Okay? Next question, yes?
In the early church, the Bible didn't even exist. And in I think the year 300, they collected all these books and they decided, okay, these are more in line with our faith, and these books are, the Bible was formed, I feel, as a purpose and a guide for people to have a relationship with Christ and to learn from the Bible characters. So my question is, couldn't the purpose of Genesis and all that was for the Israelites at the time? And at the time, the Israelites, they were given the laws of Moses, for example, but he couldn't give them the New Testament laws because they weren't ready for that. And so maybe Moses gave them a simpler interpretation so they could, something simple versus something very complex. And so my question is, should we be using the Bible as a guide and as a relationship with God versus something that we're just like trying to reconcile it with science?
So thank you for the question. Just a couple of, like a quick modification. Actually, the New Testament canon was almost formed by the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century. So yes, the council that ratified it was in year 300, but actually the books and what they considered to be canonical versus not, almost by the beginning of the 2nd century has started. Your point about Moses and when this was written is extremely well taken, and this is actually the theory, for example, for somebody like John Walton or those who are proposing the framework. It's like, what was the mentality of the Israelites reading this in Sinai, going into the promised land at that point? Where their mentality is like, we just left Egypt where there was a lot of deities, and we're going and we crossed the Red Sea and we're going to Canaan, and we heard these horror stories about Canaan, okay? And that's why they didn't want to go. When they sent the spies, 10 out of the 12 said no. Okay, and what he was trying to give to them? It's like, there is no multiple deities, it's one God. And it's one God who created you, who endowed you with this power. So it has a theological message, and you're absolutely right. Should we just be reading in its simplest face value of the theological message that God created us and created us for good without getting into the details? Because this what would a Jewish believer at that time would have understood from it. I think your point is well taken, but this is where the debate comes into place. But this is an argument that a framework theory or a functional creation would advocate. Okay? Yes. I don't know who has the microphone. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yes.
There have been some evidence about previous civilizations that went to extinct or something like that, like Tassili caves in Algeria, where there are drawings of flying men with suits or whatever. And these drawings, I don't know how they got the age, radioactive or something like that. It was back like 12,000 years ago. So doesn't that contradict with the Bible's
It's a great
timeline?
question. So I'm actually going to maybe modify this because I think this is a very tough argument. So you might say that, okay, you know what? I am a scientist. I believe in, evolution. I believe in the Neanderthal. I believe in the caveman. I believe in Homo erectus. I believe in all those, okay? And those existed, but when God created man, the biblical man, as we know from the biblical message, it's about 7,000 years, okay? So then you're going to have to ask yourself the question, well, okay, so this is biblical man. What do you think of those creatures? Let's call them creatures for now. What do you think of them? So the answers would differ on this. Somebody would come and tell you, well, you know what? Those were not, mankind. Those were not intelligent. Those were just a bunch of maybe smart apes. But then somebody would argue against this and tell you, well, you know what? Those creatures, when they buried themselves, or when they got buried their loved ones, they buried with them actually tools. They buried with them paintings. They buried with them sources of intelligence, things that show that they're intelligent creatures. So those are not apes. You can't make that those are extinct apes. Those are extinct intelligent creatures. They may not be the same intelligence as modern day man, but they were nevertheless intelligent. So then the answer that most Christians in this camp, which would include a lot of Orthodox, would tell you, those were lines of creation, not mankind. Lines of creation that God created and He allowed them to be extinct at some point, for whatever reason. Very similar to dinosaurs. We don't doubt that dinosaurs lived, but they got extinct. Why? We don't know. There's a great theory that God allowed dinosaurs to be created and to be extinct so we can have oil to use at this point. I think it's a stretch, but it's very interesting hypothesis. But those would be creatures that God created and let them extinct, but they are not the same as mankind, okay? And they were semi-intelligent. Did God have a relationship with them? I don't know. But then, in modern day biblical times, 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, God created man in what we know from the biblical story. Okay? So also it depends on which camp you're in. If you're a theistic evolutionist, you will see a continuous line between those. If you're a progressive creationist who thinks of a special creation of man, then you probably say those were another line that was extinct, just like most other lines. Yes? Okay. Oh, sorry, who has, okay, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry, yeah, he has the microphone. I didn't know who has the microphone.
Sorry, Habibi. So I'd like to start my question with a short allegory. So Slaughterhouse-Five, I'm sure some of you guys have read it, written by Kurt Vonnegut. So Kurt Vonnegut had an interview one time, and the interviewer was like, I really like what you did with the symbolism of this color with this doorknob, and they were really like, oh man, I love when you did this. And Kurt Vonnegut's response was, what? And he laughed, because he didn't intend any of that. And this person who was reading this book imposed his own meaning on something that Kurt Vonnegut had written. So what I know to be true, and what we've talked about earlier today, is biological evolution, that the near certainty of common descent, that is not really even an issue amongst people who know and study these things, as I'm sure you'll attest. I know that to be our best understanding of truth in evolution and in our world now. And I see that that doesn't fit perfectly well with the literal interpretation of the Bible. and that there are 5 or 6 different worldviews that we can take on to try to reconcile these two issues, right? Now, you've spent a lot of time and you did very well explaining all these worldviews and showing how they all make sense.
These are actually biblical views, not worldviews. Because
Oh,
worldview
okay.
is not, like, it's a biblical interpretation.
Biblical interpretations that inform your worldview. And a lot of them made sense. I think as we went through them, each of them made sense. And for me, the issue is an issue of concordism that you talked about earlier. I think I'm pronouncing that wrong, but it's that we spend all this time making stuff up. I feel like, I mean, they can't all be true. I mean, maybe they can, and I'm sure you'll talk about that, but a lot of these explanations, I mean, you yourself said, are very creative, meaning that they were created. And I think that's what it is. We spend a lot of time saying, okay, how can we fit this, and making stuff up to fit what we want, because our presupposition, I'm sorry, I'll get to the point. The presupposition is that the Bible is inerrant, right? And we do all of this because we start with that presupposition. And I just wonder, wouldn't it be easier to have an honest inquiry, throw away that presupposition, and start from a fact, is this true? And maybe possibly entertain the idea that the simpler and more reasonable explanation is, instead of coming up with all this stuff, to say biological evolution doesn't need a guiding hand, and you said yourself that there is evidence for and against that. And we don't know everything, and we're learning more. Studies are coming out every day. Wouldn't it make more sense, isn't it the easier assumption to, or the more plausible assumption to say that, instead of to make 6 or 7 stories that, 5 or 6 stories that can possibly equivocate some of the issues that are in the Bible to fit this? Thank you.
So I agree with some of your points and I disagree with some of them. I think it is very tough when you're looking at different models of interpretation and you would say, well, are you forcing too much into the text that is not there? Okay? Whether it is a gap theory, a day gap theory, a day age theory, a framework, whatever it is. I agree with what you're saying there. However, saying that, there are certain things that no matter what these different models of interpretation disagree upon, that they all agree upon, and that is what I hold to in my biblical understanding, and I would not budge away from that. Okay? And this is where the point of faith in the revelation, with all due respect, okay, when I look at the scientific evidence gets me to a point where after that I don't have more information. The beginning of life, I don't have more information after that. The beginning of the universe, I don't have more information after that. After that, for both the atheist and myself, it is a leap of faith. For the atheist, it's a leap of faith when he would come and tell me that before the Big Bang, nothing existed. For the atheist, it's a leap of faith when they would say that the first cell came on this earth, like Francis Crick, who discovered the DNA, came and said it was implanted by aliens. Why? Because he just doesn't want to admit God. His best theory that came was something called panspermia, that he said that aliens came from a different universe and put the first cell on this universe. And this is the guy who discovered DNA, Francis Crick. So, how does he get to that conclusion? It's a leap of faith. So for me, the biological argument cannot take me beyond that. So what about the biblical argument? The biblical argument, as I said, we can debate a lot within this box. But what are the framework of this box? What is the framework? That if you're outside of this box, with all due respect, you have made a leap of faith, and I don't think we're in the same camp. This framework of this box is that only God is immortal. Only God is the one who created. He created the universe out of nothing. The universe was not eternal. He created the universe for good. We can discuss a little bit what good is. Okay? But it was good. And He created it for a relationship that is glorious with mankind. That is my framework that I'm going by. No matter what I am debating inside this box, that framework has never changed. And somebody asked me yesterday how you don't lose faith when you're reading all these books. Why? Because I have a very, very clear understanding in myself. What is my framework and what's inside the box? What's inside the box, yes, I read pros and cons for different arguments. I read pros and cons for different interpretation. But that framework has never changed a bit. Okay? Where did I get this framework? Not from science. I got it from the biblical revelation. Where would an atheist bring his framework? It would be from his own faith and his own philosophy, not from his science. Okay? All right? We're done? I know, yeah, we're running quite late. All right, guys. One last one?
Yeah.
Okay, one last one.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Time is a man-made concept, and we know that Genesis was written by Moses. So, in my opinion, it's like his interpretation of events as dictated by God, and obviously the Holy Spirit plays a role. But how reliable is it, and is there like a sense of bias surrounding his interpretation, and should it just be taken wholly on faith?
So I don't think Moses interpreted, Moses wrote, okay? And this is the toughness, is that he uses a same word could denote multiple different meanings. When he uses the word yom, which is day, what does that mean? Because that same word is used within the context of Genesis in two different meanings. So I don't think it's Moses' problem, it's our problem. You see what I'm saying? My problem is like, okay, when you look at the word yom, can you take it in a literal 24, or it would denote an unidentified period? Okay? And that's where I think you study biblical interpretation and you look at the rules and the laws of that, and then you make up your knowledge from this. But I don't think Moses, was planning to sway us in one direction or the other. You're absolutely right, he used for him what was most applicable to his language. He could not write about aliens, but then the Holy Spirit would guide him in what language that he used. You remember the first word I said, that the message is timeless, but the language is conditioned by the culture and the time that you live in. So he used the language that was conditioned by his time and by his age. But I do believe that the message that Moses was putting is far beyond the length of the day. When I step back and read Genesis 1 to 3, I truly believe that the message in it is far more profound than just length of days and length of creation. I think that, and I'm going to end with this. I believe the whole Genesis 1 to 3 talks about a relationship. Talks about a relationship between God and mankind. Talks about a relationship that God intended it for it to be glorious and mankind messed it up. Talks about the base work for redemption, because where you find in Genesis 3 that the seed of the woman shall redeem. The seed of the woman shall crush the serpent. That is the first gospel. In fact, that's what our Father called the proto-evangelion. It was the first promise of deliverance. That's what I read in Genesis 1 to 3. It is a beautiful story of a special relationship that I, with my free will, messed up. But yet God, out of His infinite love, decided to redeem me and you and all of us from such a bad outcome and to restore that relationship. That's what I read out of Genesis 1 to 3. Thank you for your time.